The North isn't a place. It's just a direction out of the South. Roy Blount, Jr.
In this third part of the geography of wealth, we are going to be discussing the North-South divide. And I'm not referring to the Mason-Dixon line here. I am referring to the idea that in most metropolitan areas in the United States and in Europe, the northern side of the city tends to be the wealthier part of the city, and the northern suburbs of a metro area, more often than not, are wealthier than the southern suburbs of that same metro area. The reasons that this phenomenon happens is varied. Some of it has to do with geography and climate. In places that were heavily industrial cities with a lot of pollutants from factories, the affluent and the wealthy wanted to live the opposite direction of where the wind blows away industrial exhaust. So, and oftentimes in most cities in America and Europe, that happens to be north, and the wind blows all of the fumes south, and therefore the poorer neighborhoods are in the south because they're more exposed to pollution. A lot of it just has to do with psychology. There's a study done by Gettysburg College where academics did surveys showing that locations of neighborhoods on a map, and people assumed that the northern locations were better simply just because they were above the other cities on the map, and so therefore they are superior because they're located higher on the map. And they've done studies where they're the same neighborhoods except the city's inverted, and they don't give the same preferential treatment. So there's a psychological component of being above the rest of the people in the city, even though north on a map is kind of a social arbitrary construction. Let's get into specific cities where I show examples. We'll include some of the older cities we discussed in previous Geography of Money, plus a couple new ones to provide context on this phenomenon. Let's first start with Los Angeles, which now I have in a more visually appealing format to see the old and new money neighborhoods. So you notice in Los Angeles County, almost every one of the wealthy neighborhoods, both the old and new money areas, happen to be north of Santa Monica Boulevard and the 10 freeway. Whereas the poor parts of Los Angeles County are in the south. And the one exception really to this are south-facing coasts, just due to the appeal of living on the beach. Cities and metro areas where they have a south-facing coast tend to not have the same north-south dynamics. And often it is the inverted, such as in Orange County, California, where the southern part of Orange County tends to be the more affluent, and Rancho Palos Verdes is a good example of this too. We also see this in San Francisco, where the wealthiest neighborhoods happen to be on the north side of the city, and the southern side of the city is less prosperous, and some of the poorest neighborhoods are in the southeast in the city, such as Bayview and Hunters Point. And within the suburbs, North County, Marin is one of the wealthiest suburbs in the San Francisco Bay Area. And so we see it apply here. It doesn't just apply to large cities either. I'm going to use Fresno and the next door neighbor suburb, Clovis, as an example of a smaller metropolitan area that has a similar north-south dynamic. And Fresno, also interesting, is more of an agriculture town and not really into heavy industry, so the factory dynamic doesn't really play a role here. But if you look at Fresno, which is the fifth largest metropolitan area in California after Sacramento, Los Angeles, San Francisco Bay Area, and San Diego, there's one dividing street that separates really the north and the south of Fresno, and that's Shaw Avenue. Basically everything north of Shaw Avenue in Fresno is middle class, upper middle class, or wealthy communities, and it looks like a Midwestern suburb that just happens to be in the Central Valley of California. However, if you go just one block south of Shaw Avenue, the story becomes very different. The poverty rates are much higher, you have much higher crime, and it's a much poorer city. And the divide I've seen in Fresno is one of the most stark of really any of the cities in my travels in terms of the impact of the north-south divide. Continuing with California, you see the north-south divide as well in San Diego, where both the old money and new money neighborhoods are predominantly in the northern part of San Diego, with the notable exception of Coronado. Whereas the southern part of the city, particularly the closer you get to the Mexican border, the poorer, more polluted, and the more dangerous the city becomes. Yeah, I know I'm using this as an excuse to just show all of the cities from the first part of this with the better visuals that you can see the neighborhoods more clearly, but Phoenix, this also applies. Old and new money in Phoenix are in the northeast, and the south of Phoenix tends to not be as prosperous. We can't really discuss the north-south divide without discussing Chicago, which of the biggest cities in America has the most evident north-south divide, whereas old money and new money areas in Chicago are both in the northern parts of the city itself and the northern suburbs. You see the south side, on the other hand, has a reputation of having some of the highest crime rate in the United States and has some of the highest poverty in the Midwest. There are nice suburbs in the south side, but within the city limits, the south side Chicago versus the north side Chicago classically fits this north side south side divide. It's not just an American phenomenon either. If you look at London, with the exception of Wimbledon, pretty much every old and new money enclave in London is either on the Thames River or to the north of the Thames River, whereas south of the Thames River is much more working class. The only really city we covered previously where this doesn't apply somewhat is New York, and the reason why that doesn't really apply in New York is New York has a south-facing coast, which is kind of the general exception to the north-south divide in Europe and North America. And the first of the new cities we're going to talk about here is what you guys are tuned in for, is Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. perfectly encapsulates this north-south divide, both within the district and within the suburbs. Within the district, the old money neighborhoods are Cleveland Park and Georgetown. Those happen to also be on the northern side of the District of Columbia. And when it comes to the new money neighborhoods in the District of Columbia, it applies as well. In the neighborhoods, particularly Berkeley and Spring Valley, which also happen to be on the north side of the District of Columbia. The south side of the District of Columbia, on the other hand, is very poor and has a high crime rate, and some of the highest crime rate in the country. And this have and have not divide on north-south lines is very evident here. And it also really applies to the suburbs, because the new money and the old money suburbs of DC are both in the northern part of the DC metropolitan area. The old money suburbs are in Maryland. They're primarily the area around Bethesda, Chevy Chase, and Silver Spring, Maryland. That's where the old money suburbs, they're right next to the district, a similar pattern too. They're right next to the city, but aren't in the city, so they don't have to deal with the district politics and the problems of the city directly. And this applies to the Maryland suburbs of Washington, D.C. In terms of the new money suburbs in D.C., they tend to be in Northern Virginia, which was developed later than Maryland. As the U.S. government and the defense industry continues to grow, you have seen the D.C. metro area grow. In fact, if you look at the highest income zip codes in the country, you would see a disproportionate amount of them in Washington, D.C. And the new money areas in the D.C. suburbs are in Northern Virginia and Fairfax County. The two cities particularly that stood out in my research on this were McLean, Virginia, and Tyson's Corner, Virginia, as the new money enclaves of D.C. And they are in a state that is south of Maryland, and technically it's mostly south of the District of Columbia, but that particular part of Virginia is actually north of the District of Columbia. So the north-south divide applies too. And the other fun fact about DC is I've been doing a survey as part of a future Analyzing Finance with Nick tour, where I'm going to be visiting subscribers once we have enough people sign up in their given city. And DC so far has the most votes of any city for me to visit in the United States, which is a surprising leader. I thought it would be New York or in Los Angeles, but DC is at the top of the pack right now. And if you want your city to be a part of a future Analyzing Finance with Nick meetup tour, please fill out the survey that's going to be in the pinned comment and the description of this video. Your votes will help decide where I end up going. I hope to do that sometime in 2025. The next city we're going to look at is Boston, Massachusetts, where the old money and the new money areas all happen to be in the northern part of the greater Boston metro area. The old money areas are Beacon Hill and Back Bay. This is where the original Boston Brahmins are from, and just in general, America's oldest money, because Boston is really America's oldest big city. And then other old money enclave really is the suburb of Concord in Massachusetts. In terms of newer money in Massachusetts, it's also in the north central parts of the city. They have the South Boston waterfront, which is considered a newer money enclave, where it might be just a gentrifying area. For those Bostonians watching, you can help me with more context on this. I personally only visited Boston once, and primarily was in the downtown area. So I'm not as familiar with Boston as I was in the cities in the previous two parts of this series, or some of the other ones mentioned here. And then the other upscale new money areas in the suburbs are Chestnut Hill, where Boston College is, Newton, Massachusetts, and Weston, Massachusetts. Next, we're going to go down south to Miami and the South Florida metropolitan area. There's really not that much old money in Miami. The old money is maybe from the turn of the 20th century, because Miami was a small town. I joked in my Debunking the Doomer video on climate change that in 1912, Miami had a smaller population than the number of subscribers I had on this channel back then, which was about 1,300. And so if you had a city that small as recently as 110 years ago, you really didn't have that much super old money in South Florida. However, as Miami has developed and has become the most rapidly developing metropolitan area in America for the past century, there has been pockets of older and newer money. It does follow the north-south divide to a certain degree, and it also follows the coast to inland divide, whereas a lot of the old and new money enclaves tend to be east of the intercoastal waterway, which splits South Florida, where the nicer neighborhoods tend to be the barrier islands, and the working class and poor neighborhoods are often in the east on the mainland of Florida. So let's start with the old money in the city of Miami itself. And it's in Bal Harbor and Indian Creek, which has some of the most expensive houses in the country. This is just a single residential area, an island of like 20 or 30 mansions. The Bay Harbor Islands also I would consider, and parts of Surfside also are considered really old money. Bal Harbor kind of has a reputation of being kind of like the Beverly Hills of Miami. Whereas the newer money in like the greater Miami area is Miami Beach, which is technically not part of the city of Miami, but it's just across the bridge from downtown Miami. And this includes South Beach as well, which has a reputation of attracting young money or people who like to spend a lot if they are new money. However, South Florida is not just the city of Miami. In fact, really Miami was a relatively small city for a core metropolitan area. Most of Miami's population lives in the suburbs. The old money really in the suburbs of South Florida is in Palm Beach. Palm Beach is a barrier island. If I had to compare it to anything on the West Coast, it's a giant version of Balboa Island in Newport Beach. And this is where Mar-a-Lago is where the Flaglers built their original mansion, then the Breakers Hotel, and just a lot of the Kennedys, I think, had a place here. This is like where the real old money of Florida goes, and the Northeast old money would go for winter getaways. And if you want to look for new money, though, it also happens to be in the northern parts of greater South Florida. The newest money is in Jupiter, Florida, which is developing rapidly as an enclave of the newly wealthy, as Palm Beach has been occupied for a long time. Another area really is Delray, South Palm Beach is also a newer money enclave, and more recently, development of places like Delray Beach and Boca Raton are also new money enclaves in South Florida. And it's not just Palm Beach County though. Broward County and Miami-Dade also have new money suburbs, with the most notable of these being Parkland, which kind of stands out as being a more inland suburb for new money. Within Broward County, the two most notable new money communities are Sea Ranch Lakes and Golden Beach. Now we're heading back to the West Coast, where we're going to discuss Seattle, which is a predominantly new money city. However, unlike Miami, which is mainly built on people relocating their money from elsewhere to Miami and or real estate, Seattle is built on primarily very successful domestic companies, particularly in the technology industry. Examples include obviously Amazon, Microsoft, Starbucks, Costco, among Nordstrom's, among many others, and a lot of international companies also base their North American headquarters in Seattle, such as Nintendo of America. And with all that money coming in and being developed in the area, you've had the emergence of a lot of new money throughout Seattle. However, Seattle's been around for over a century, so it does have some pockets of old money too. The old money in Seattle is mainly concentrated in 4 different places. The first one of these is Mercer Island, which is an island in Lake Washington between the core city of Seattle and the east suburbs. And a similar theme, it's the closest place to the core of the city without being in the core of the city. Within the city of Seattle itself, you've got Madison Park and Magnolia as the old money neighborhoods. And then another old money suburb in Seattle you have is Medina on the east coast of Lake Washington. Since Seattle is primarily a new money city, you have a lot more new money cities, areas, and suburbs. Within the city of Seattle, the most notable new money neighborhood is Queen Anne. The other notable new money neighborhoods within the city limits of Seattle are Ballard and Laurelhurst. And the other thing to notice really just with Seattle is it follows the north-south divide pretty well. The northern parts of the city limits of Seattle and the northern suburbs tend to be where the old and new money are. Whereas the southern part of greater Seattle, particularly the area around Tacoma, Washington, tends to be the more historically working class parts of the greater Seattle metro area. So Seattle is another city that follows the classic north-south divide. That's really the theme of this video. In terms of new money suburbs, they're mostly east of Lake Washington, with the biggest one of these being Bellevue. And outside of Bellevue, other notable new money suburbs in the greater Seattle area include Kirkland, Washington, which a lot of the Kirkland brand stuff at Costco happens to be named after this city, if you didn't realize that already. Redmond, Washington, and Sammamish, Washington, which is over by Lake Sammamish. And the last city we're going to be talking about in today's video is Denver, which doesn't really fit any of the descriptions I mentioned. One, a lot of Denver's new money happens to be within the city limits of Denver. Second, most of the concentrated pockets of wealth in greater Denver actually happen to be south of downtown, not north. And I think that's because the industrial winds blow the opposite way in Denver than most North American cities. The other unique part of Denver, since Denver is a fairly new city, and especially in terms of being new for its metro area to really fully fill out and be developed, that the old money and new money often live in the same places because there is space for both of them. And so as a result, there really isn't a true old and new money divide in Denver. So I label all the upscale, wealthy neighborhoods that would be traditionally old or new money in other metros as orange instead of red and yellow, because they're just rich neighborhoods in general and not really old or new necessarily. And within Denver, there's three neighborhoods really that are considered the moneyed areas of Denver. It's Country Club, Cherry Creek, and Belcaro, and to a similar degree, Hilltop as well. This little area here is kind of the known as the well-to-do area within Denver itself. In the suburbs, you have the south side suburbs of Cherry Hills and Greenwood Village are kind of the upscale moneyed area in the south in terms of the suburban areas. However, there is one notable suburb, though, or exurb maybe, because it's pretty far off, that is considered a moneyed enclave of greater Denver, even though it's pretty far away geographically and also has some of the highest real estate prices really in Colorado, is Boulder. Boulder's had a lot of environmentalist restrictions, and they were put in there at a much earlier pace than the rest of Colorado. And as a result, it has the most expensive real estate outside of a few luxury ski towns in the Rockies to the west. And it's also the home of the University of Colorado. And it's attracted a bunch of new tech money, as well as a bunch of old money who just wanted the mountain lifestyle, but were close enough to the city comforts of Denver when needed. So Boulder is really the other place of money in greater Denver, Colorado. That's going to conclude this third part. Outside of really Denver and New York, really all the cities we've covered seem to fit this north-south divide. The main exceptions tend to be either a south coast or a place where industrial winds blow differently, or cities as developed in a much newer, later period of time where some of the old dynamics that drove the north-south divide weren't as strong. If you like continuing more of these geography of wealth, let me know, and please leave your suggested cities in the comments. We're going to have the Midwest, the Southeast in the United States still to cover, as well as European and Asian and Latin American cities. The comments and the suggestions have been great so far for this series, and I look forward to continuing to do it. And please keep the conversation growing and add your suggestions. And also submit your vote if you want your city to be included in the Analyzing Finance with Nick tour. And thank you for watching.